Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity slows down, the world feels a little quieter, and science becomes something you can wander through at an easy, unhurried pace. I'm glad you're here tonight, whether you're listening in the evening, in the early morning, or at some strange hour when the world outside your window is silent. This is a good moment to settle in, loosen your shoulders, and let your thoughts drift gently along with the story. Tonight, we're going to explore something unusual. Not a towering mountain, not a roaring ocean current, not even a visible border drawn on a map. Instead, we're going to follow a line that you cannot see at all. A line that runs quietly through the islands of Southeast Asia, slipping between forests, reefs, and volcanic peaks. A line that most people living nearby have never heard of, and yet it has shaped the lives of countless creatures for millions of years. Because on one side of this invisible boundary, the forests are filled with animals that belong to one part of the world. And on the other side, only a short distance away, the animals are completely different, as if the land itself belonged to another continent entirely. Kangaroos on one side, tigers on the other, cockatoos in one forest, hornbills in another. Creatures that, for the most part, never cross from one side to the other, even though no wall stands in their way. It's a quiet mystery, and like many quiet mysteries, it begins with someone simply noticing that something didn't make sense. But before we follow that trail, I'd like to ask you something gentle and simple, the kind of question that brings you back into the present moment. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you in a city apartment, hearing distant traffic and the hum of the lights outside? Or somewhere quieter, where the sounds of the night drift in through a slightly open window? And what time is it where you are right now? Late evening, perhaps. Or maybe the hour when most people are already asleep. It's funny in a way. We can be scattered across continents, oceans apart, and yet we can share the same quiet story at the same moment, each of us in our own little pocket of the world. And if you find that these kinds of journeys help you unwind, or help your mind slow down after a busy day, I'd be grateful if you gave the video a like or subscribe to the channel. It helps this calm little corner of science reach more people who might need a peaceful place to rest their thoughts for a while. Now, let's begin. Imagine standing on a small tropical island. The air is warm but not stifling, and somewhere nearby waves are folding gently onto a beach. Above you, the sky is pale blue, and the forest behind you is alive with sound. Insects hum, birds call, leaves rustle in a breeze that moves softly through the canopy. At first glance, there is nothing unusual about this place. It looks like many islands scattered across Indonesia and Malaysia. Green, lush, full of life. But if you could look more closely, if you could pause time and quietly observe every creature in the forest, you might begin to notice something strange. The birds would be unfamiliar in a particular way, the mammals too. The reptiles, the insects, even the plants in some places. They would not quite match the animals and plants living on nearby islands, even islands that you could reach in a small boat in just a few hours. It would be as if you had stepped, without realizing it, from one natural world into another. And the strangest part is this. The distance between these worlds is sometimes no more than a narrow stretch of sea. Water that birds can easily fly across, that storms can sweep across, that drifting vegetation could cross in a matter of days. So why didn't the animals cross? Why did entire ecosystems remain separated, as if held apart by a boundary no one could see? To understand that, we need to slow down and think about how animals move across the earth. Because movement at first glance seems easy. Birds can fly, fish can swim, mammals can walk, climb, or drift on floating debris, seeds can ride the wind, insects can be carried by storms, and over long periods of time these small movements add up. Species spread, forests change, new populations appear in new places. That's how life has always worked, or at least most of the time. But sometimes, the Earth creates barriers that are far more powerful than they appear. Barriers that do not look like barriers at all. A narrow strait, a change in ocean depth, a shift in climate thousands or millions of years ago that left behind a quiet, invisible boundary. The line we're exploring tonight is one of those boundaries. Scientists call it the Wallace Line, named after a naturalist who first realised what was happening, but at its heart, it is simply a reminder that the world is shaped not only by what we can see, but by forces that operate quietly, patiently, over immense spans of time. And perhaps that is one of the most comforting things about studying the natural world. So much of it unfolds slowly, gently, without urgency. Forests grow leaf by leaf. Coral reefs build themselves grain by grain. Evolution works generation by generation, so gradually that no single creature ever notices it happening. You could spend your entire life on one of those islands, listening to birds in the morning and insects at night, and never realise that just a few dozen kilometres away, the rules of life are completely different. It's a little like living in a house where one room follows different seasons than another, except the walls are invisible and no one tells you the boundary exists. The story of this line also begins with travel, not the fast, comfortable travel we know today, but the slow, uncertain journeys of the 19th century, where naturalists crossed oceans in wooden ships, spent months in unfamiliar climates, and kept careful notes about every bird, every beetle, every shell. Those early explorers were patient observers. They had to be. Without satellite images or genetic analysis, the only way to understand nature was to watch it carefully, to compare, to notice patterns that others might overlook. And sometimes those patterns were subtle at first. A slightly different type of bird, a mammal that appeared on one island but never on another, a repetition of the same curious absence, again and again, until the absence itself became impossible to ignore. That is often how scientific discoveries begin, not with a sudden flash, but with a quiet, persistent sense that something doesn't fit. You might recognise that feeling from everyday life, the moment when you misplace something and feel that small and nagging certainty that it should be somewhere obvious, or when a familiar route looks slightly different, and you can't immediately tell why. Our minds are very good at noticing patterns, and sometimes, when the pattern breaks, that's when the real questions begin. In the islands of Southeast Asia, the pattern broke in a remarkable way. Animals that were common across Asia, monkeys, deer, large cats, suddenly vanished beyond a certain point, and in their place appeared creatures more closely related to those of Australia, marsupials, cockatoos, and other species that seemed completely out of place if you assumed all the islands belonged to the same biological world. It was as if two different continents had been stitched together, but the stitching remained visible to anyone who looked closely enough, and yet the boundary was not drawn by humans. No treaty created it. No fence marked it. It existed because of geology, climate, and the slow movement of continents over millions of years, processes so gradual that they are almost impossible to imagine in ordinary human terms. If you think about time in those scales, millions of years, it begins to feel very different from the hours and days we usually measure. Mountains rise and erode, seas advance and retreat. Land bridges appear and disappear as ice ages come and go. And animals, following food, following climate, following instinct, spread as far as they can until they reach a barrier they cannot cross. Sometimes that barrier is obvious, like a desert or a mountain range, but sometimes it is hidden beneath the surface of the ocean, a deep channel where no land bridge ever formed, even when sea levels were much lower than today. That is part of what makes the Wallace Line so fascinating. It is not just a line on a map, it is the trace of ancient oceans, of continental plates that never quite touched, of deep waters that remained deep even when the world was colder and the seas withdrew. And the animals, without knowing any of this, responded simply by staying where survival was possible. There's something quietly humbling about that. Creatures do not need to understand geology or evolution. They simply live, adapt, reproduce, and over time, entire ecosystems emerge, shaped by forces far larger than any individual life. If you were to sit quietly in one of those forests at dusk, you wouldn't see a boundary. You would see fireflies blinking in the undergrowth, hear the distant call of birds settling for the night, feel the air cooling slightly as the sun disappears. Nature does not announce its borders, it simply expresses them in feathers and fur, in the presence of some species and the absence of others. And that absence can tell us as much as presence, sometimes more. But before we get there, it helps to picture the setting clearly. Because the Wallace Line is not a single straight mark. It winds between islands, through narrow seas, across a region that is one of the most complex and beautiful parts of the world. A place of volcanoes and rainforests, coral reefs and monsoon skies, where thousands of islands rise from the sea like scattered stepping stones. If you were to spread a large map across a table and slowly smooth it flat with your hands, the first thing you might notice about Southeast Asia is how intricate it is. This is not a region defined by one great landmass or a few large islands. Instead, it is a maze of peninsulas, archipelagos, narrow straits and seas that weave together in a pattern so complex it almost looks accidental. Thousands upon thousands of islands are scattered here, some large enough to hold mountain ranges and cities, others no bigger than a few stretches of sand and trees. At first glance, nothing about this geography suggests a sharp biological boundary. The islands sit close together in many places. From one shore, you can often see the next island rising blue and hazy on the horizon. Fishing boats cross these waters every day. Storms sweep across them. Birds fly overhead without hesitation. And yet, hidden within this tangled geography is a line that separates two vast biological worlds. To understand where that line lies, it helps to orient ourselves gently, the way a traveller might, not by memorising coordinates, but by picturing the land and sea in broad strokes. To the west lies mainland Asia, stretching through Thailand, Malaysia and beyond. From there, the land continues outward into large islands that were once connected to the continent itself. Sumatra, Borneo and Java form a chain of lush tropical landscapes, filled with dense rainforests, winding rivers, and animals that share deep evolutionary roots with those of the Asian mainland. Elephants, rhinoceroses, tigers, monkeys, deer, and countless smaller creatures all belong to this side of the world. If you walk through a forest in Borneo millions of years ago, many of the animals around you would have looked familiar to a naturalist studying India or southern China. But now imagine travelling eastward. You leave Borneo or Bali, board a small boat, and cross a stretch of sea that might take only a few hours to traverse. The water is calm, the sky wide, and nothing about the journey feels particularly dramatic. There are no towering waves or violent currents to suggest that you're crossing anything more significant than a narrow channel. And yet, when you arrive on the far shore, something subtle begins to change. The birds sound different. The mammals are unfamiliar. The balance of life itself feels altered, as if the forest is speaking in a slightly different dialect. You have crossed the Wallace Line. What makes this so remarkable is how abrupt the change can be. In some places, the boundary runs between islands separated by less than 40 kilometres of water. That is a distance many birds could cross in a single flight. It is a distance floating vegetation could drift across in a storm. So why didn't the animals follow? The answer lies not in the distance across the surface, but in what lies beneath it. If you could drain the seas of Southeast Asia, if the water slowly receded until the ocean floor lay exposed to the air, the shape of the land would tell a very different story. To the west of the Wallace Line, the seabed is relatively shallow. During the ice ages, when large amounts of Earth's water were locked up in glaciers and sea levels dropped, these shallow seas became dry land. Vast plains connected the islands of Sumatra, Borneo and Java directly to mainland Asia. Animals could walk from one to the other without ever seeing the sea. This ancient landmass is known as Sunderland. It was not a small extension of the continent, but a broad, continuous landscape of forests, rivers and grasslands, home to herds of mammals and predators that roamed freely across enormous distances. Now, picture the land to the east. Here, the seabed plunges much more steeply. Even during the lower sea levels of the ice ages, deep channels remained filled with water. No land bridges formed, no wide plains emerged to connect the islands. These islands, including places like Sulawesi and Lombok, remained isolated, separated not only by water, but by time itself, cut off from the migrations that shaped the ecosystems of Asia. This eastern region was part of another ancient landmass entirely, one that included Australia and New Guinea, often called Sahel. Long ago these lands were connected, allowing marsupials, parrots and many other species to spread across them. So the Wallace Line is not simply a line between islands. It is the meeting point of two ancient continents that never fully merged, a place where deep ocean trenches prevented the mingling of entire branches of the Tree of Life. What is especially striking is how clearly this division shows itself in the animals that live on either side. On the western side, mammals dominate in ways familiar to us. Large placental mammals, animals that give birth to relatively well-developed young, fill many ecological roles. Primates swing through the trees, big cats stalk through the undergrowth, hoofed animals graze in open spaces. On the eastern side, those animals are almost entirely absent. Instead, marsupials appear, mammals that carry their young in pouches, creatures more closely related to kangaroos and possums than to deer or tigers. Birds, too, reflect this division, with cockatoos and birds of paradise appearing where hornbills and pheasants fade away. It is not a gradual transition. It is a shift, as though someone quietly rearranged the cast of a play while the scenery remained the same. For early naturalists, this must have been deeply puzzling. The climate is similar across much of the region. The forests look alike. The rivers and mountains follow no obvious dividing line, and yet the animals tell a different story, one written not in the present landscape, but in the deep past. There is something fascinating about boundaries that are invisible to the eye, but unmistakable to the mind once you know where to look. It is a bit like noticing a subtle accent in someone's speech, or recognizing a familiar melody played on a different instrument. The difference is not obvious at first, but once you hear it, you cannot unhear it. The Wallace Line works in much the same way. Once scientists began mapping the distributions of species carefully, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Island after island fell neatly into one category or the other, as though life itself were obeying a rule no one had announced. Even today, with satellites, genetic studies and detailed ecological surveys, the boundary remains one of the clearest examples of biogeography, the study of how species are distributed across the Earth. But it is worth pausing for a moment to imagine how surprising this discovery must have been at the time. In the 19th century, the idea that continents could move, that sea levels could rise and fall dramatically, or that species could evolve over vast spans of time was still new or controversial. Many naturalists believed that species were fixed, created as they were, and remaining unchanged. So when someone began to notice that animals changed abruptly across a narrow stretch of sea, it raised profound questions. Why should geography matter so much? Why should two nearby islands host entirely different forms of life? These questions did not just lead to the identification of a line on a map, they helped shape the broader understanding of evolution itself. But before we follow that thread, it helps to linger a little longer with the geography, because the landscape here is not only complex but dynamic. Volcanoes rise and fall, earthquakes reshape coastlines, coral reefs grow slowly upward, building entire islands over thousands of years. The region sits along what geologists call the Ring of Fire, an arc of tectonic activity that encircles much of the Pacific Ocean. Here, the Earth's crust is constantly shifting, plates sliding beneath one another, mountains rising, islands forming. This restless geology has played a role in shaping the distribution of life. Islands appear and disappear over geological time, creating opportunities for species to spread, become isolated, and evolve in new directions. But even amid all this change, the deep channels marking the Wallace Line remained persistent barriers. They were simply too deep, too wide at their base, ever to become dry land. So while forests advanced and retreated, while climates warmed and cooled, while sea levels rose and fell, this invisible boundary endured. There is something quietly powerful about that idea. The surface of the world changes constantly, but certain underlying features shape the course of life for millions of years, guiding migrations, isolating populations, and influencing the paths evolution can take. It reminds us that the history of life is not only a story of adaptation and survival, but also a story of geography, of continents drifting, of oceans deepening, of landscapes forming barriers and bridges in ways that no single creature could ever perceive. If you were a small mammal living on one of those islands tens of thousands of years ago, the Wallace Line would mean nothing to you as an idea. You would not know that a deep ocean trench lay beyond the horizon, preventing your kind from spreading farther east. You would simply live your life, searching for food, avoiding predators, raising your young, unaware that the edge of your world lay just beyond the reach of your instincts. And perhaps there is something calming in that thought. Most of the forces that shape our lives, and the lives of all creatures, operate quietly, far beyond our awareness. The turning of the earth, the movement of continents, the slow shifting of climates, all continue whether we notice them or not. The Wallace Line is one of those quiet forces, not a physical wall, but a consequence of the deep structure of the planet itself. Seen from high above, the region between Asia and Australia looks almost seamless. A glittering scatter of islands set in warm blue water, clouds drifting lazily over mountain ridges and winding coastlines. If you didn't know what to look for, nothing about this view would suggest that two entirely different biological worlds meet here. There is no wall, no sudden change in climate, no desert or frozen barrier separating one realm from another. Just ocean, islands, and forests that appear, at first glance, much the same. And yet, beneath that calm surface lies one of the most remarkable divisions on Earth, a divide so profound that animals on one side are often more closely related to creatures thousands of kilometres away than to those living just across a narrow channel of water. To understand how this can be, it helps to imagine the Earth not as it looks today, but as it looked long ago, when continents were arranged differently, when sea levels rose and fell dramatically, and when the ancestors of modern animals were spreading across the land in ways that would shape the world for millions of years to come. Long before humans sailed these waters, long before even the earliest hominins walked upright, the land that is now Southeast Asia formed part of a vast extension of the Asian continent. Forests stretched uninterrupted across what are now islands. Rivers flowed across plains that today lie hidden beneath shallow seas. Herds of animals wandered freely across territories that no longer exist as continuous land. At the same time, far to the south and east, another great landmass existed, a continent that included present-day Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania. This land too supported its own unique collection of animals, many of which followed evolutionary paths quite different from those of their counterparts in Asia. For immense spans of time, these two regions remained separated by deep ocean basins. The continents drifted, climates shifted, and species evolved in isolation, adapting to their environments in ways that reflected not only local conditions, but also their ancient ancestry. When sea levels dropped during the Great Ice Ages, enormous quantities of water became locked in glaciers. Coastlines expanded, shallow seas dried into land bridges, animals migrated across newly exposed plains, spreading into new territories. But the deep channels between these two ancient worlds remained filled with water. No land bridges formed there, The gap persisted, sometimes narrower, sometimes wider, but always present. That persistent gap is the quiet foundation of the divide we see today. It is easy to underestimate the power of a relatively small stretch of ocean, especially when viewed on a map. After all, birds can fly, storms can carry insects across great distances. Even small mammals on rare occasions have been known to raft across water on floating vegetation after floods or landslides. But successful colonization is not just about arrival. It is about survival, reproduction, and the establishment of a stable population. And that requires more than a single lucky journey. It requires enough individuals arriving often enough to sustain a species in a new place. Deep water makes that extraordinarily difficult. The seas marking the boundary between Asia and Australia are not only deep but complex. Currents flow in patterns shaped by monsoons, tides, and the intricate geography of the islands. Winds shift with the seasons. Storms can be fierce, but they are also unpredictable, scattering debris in directions that may not lead towards suitable land. And even when an animal does manage to cross, it may find itself in an environment where familiar food sources are absent, predators are different, and competitors occupy ecological roles that leave little room for newcomers. Over thousands and millions of years these factors accumulate. The few that cross rarely succeed. The many that remain continue evolving along separate paths. The result is a biological divide so sharp that it can be traced not only in large animals but in birds, reptiles, insects, and even plants. Imagine walking through a forest on the western side of this boundary. You might hear the rustling of monkeys in the canopy, the distant call of a hornbill, the occasional movement of a civet or deer in the undergrowth. The ecosystem feels familiar in a broad sense, resembling forests across much of tropical Asia. Now imagine crossing the sea and stepping into a forest on the eastern side. The air feels similar. The trees may even look similar at first glance. But the sounds are different. The birds have unfamiliar calls. The mammals are smaller, often marsupials rather than placental mammals. Some animals seem almost out of place if you're accustomed to Asian wildlife, as though the forest itself belongs to another continent entirely. In a sense, it does. The Eastern Islands form part of a transition zone that connects to the Australian biological realm, a region shaped by millions of years of independent evolution. Marsupials, which in Asia are rare or absent, become more common. Birds share ancestry with species found in New Guinea and Australia, rather than with those of mainland Asia. It is as if two libraries of life developed separately and were then placed side by side, their collections distinct, even though their shelves now stand only a short distance apart. What makes this divide especially intriguing is that it does not correspond neatly to political borders or even to obvious geographic features. It cuts between islands, sometimes passing through narrow straits where the water appears calm and unremarkable. To a sailor navigating these waters centuries ago, there would have been no sign of the profound difference lying just beyond the horizon. The sea does not change colour. The winds do not shift abruptly. The sky remains the same wide dome overhead. Only the living world changes. There is something quietly fascinating about boundaries that reveal themselves only through careful observation. They remind us that the world is full of patterns that are easy to miss if we look only at the surface. Consider how often subtle differences shape our everyday experiences. The way a neighbourhood changes from one street to the next. The way accents shift gradually as you travel across a country. The way certain plants appear only on one side of a hill, where the soil or sunlight differs just slightly. Nature often works in gradients and transitions, but occasionally it creates divisions that are surprisingly sharp. The strange divide between Asia and Australia is one of those rare cases where the boundary is not only real, but strikingly clear once you know where to look. It also offers a glimpse into the deeper processes that shape life on Earth. Evolution does not happen in isolation from geography. Mountains, rivers, deserts, and oceans all influence which populations interact and which remain separated. Isolation, in particular, is a powerful force. When groups of organisms are cut off from one another, they begin to change in different ways. Mutations accumulate. Natural selection favours different traits in different environments. Over time, species diverge, becoming distinct enough that even if they were reunited, they might no longer interbreed. The islands along this divide are like natural laboratories of isolation. Some are large, supporting complex ecosystems where species have evolved in remarkable ways. Others are small, hosting only a handful of mammals or birds, but still reflecting the broader pattern of separation. One of the most intriguing aspects of this region is the presence of what scientists call transitional zones, areas where species from both sides appear, though often in reduced numbers. These zones are not mixtures in the sense of blending evenly. Instead, they are mosaics, with some species penetrating a little farther than others, depending on their ability to disperse. Birds, for example, are generally better at crossing water than mammals, and so the avian boundary is sometimes less abrupt. Reptiles, insects and plants each show their own patterns, influenced by their methods of dispersal and their tolerance for different environments. But even with these variations, the overall divide remains unmistakable. If you were to chart the distribution of species carefully, marking where each one occurs, you would see a line emerging, not perfectly straight, but persistent, running between islands like an invisible thread woven through the geography. This thread tells a story not only about animals, but about the Earth itself. Continents drift slowly, carried by the movement of tectonic plates. Oceans open and close, mountain ranges rise and erode. Over millions of years, these processes reshape the surface of the planet in ways that profoundly influence the course of evolution. The boundary between Asia and Australia is, in part, a legacy of those ancient movements, a reminder that the living world is inseparable from the physical world beneath it. It is also a reminder of how patient the processes of nature can be. The separation of these faunas did not happen overnight. It unfolded gradually, over spans of time so vast that human history occupies only the tiniest fraction of them. And yet when we look at a map today, we can still see the imprint of those ancient events, preserved in the distribution of species across islands and seas. There is something comforting in a way about that continuity. The world changes, but it also remembers. The shape of coastlines, the depth of ocean basins, the routes of ancient migrations, all leave traces that persist long after the events themselves have passed. If you were to sit quietly on a beach along one of these islands at dusk, listening to the waves and watching the sky fade from blue to violet, you might feel that sense of deep time in a subtle way. The tide rising and falling, the stars appearing one by one, the distant silhouettes of islands on the horizon, all part of a rhythm that has continued for ages beyond counting. And somewhere beyond those silhouettes lies another world, similar yet different, shaped by its own history, its own paths of evolution, its own quiet stories unfolding in forests and rivers. Long before satellites traced the shapes of continents, and long before scientists could compare DNA to reconstruct the history of life, understanding the natural world required something simpler and in many ways more demanding. It required patience, it required careful attention, and above all it required the willingness to spend years, sometimes decades, simply observing what was there. In the middle of the 19th century, one person was doing exactly that, travelling slowly through the islands of Southeast Asia, moving from one humid coastline to another, from dense jungle to quiet villages, carrying notebooks, specimen boxes, and an unshakable curiosity about the living world. His name was Alfred Russel Wallace. If you had met Wallace at the beginning of his journeys, nothing about him would have suggested that he was about to uncover one of the most important patterns in the natural history of the planet. He was not wealthy. He was not formally trained at a prestigious university. He did not begin his career surrounded by laboratories or institutions. Instead, he was largely self-taught, driven by an intense interest in nature, and by a quiet determination to understand how species came to be where they were. In many ways, Wallace was a traveller first and a scientist second. Though the two roles soon became inseparable, he supported himself by collecting specimens, birds, insects, mammals, plants, and sending them back to Europe, where museums and private collectors eagerly purchased them. It was difficult work. The forests were hot and often wet. Illness was common. Travel between islands could be slow and uncertain, dependent on weather, ships, and the unpredictable rhythms of the sea. Yet Wallace persisted, year after year, moving steadily across the region, observing not only the animals themselves but also the subtle patterns in their distribution. At first, those patterns must have seemed like scattered clues, small details that didn't yet form a complete picture. A certain bird species appearing on one island but absent on another. A mammal common in one region but nowhere to be found just a short distance away. Individually, such observations might not have seemed remarkable. Islands often differ in their wildlife, but Wallace had an unusual gift for noticing repetition. When the same pattern appeared again and again, he began to suspect that something deeper was at work. To appreciate how difficult this realization must have been, it helps to imagine the conditions under which he was working. There were no comprehensive field guides, no global databases, no quick ways to confirm whether a species existed elsewhere. Every observation had to be recorded by hand, every comparison made slowly, often months or years after the specimens were collected. Wallace relied on memory, on careful labelling, on letters exchanged with other naturalists that might take months to arrive. Science in those days moved at the speed of ships and ink drying on paper, and yet, despite these limitations, he began to notice something extraordinary. As he travelled eastward through the islands, the animals changed in a way that was too consistent to be random. The birds especially caught his attention. On one island, he would find species closely related to those of mainland Asia. On another, not far away, the birds resembled those of Australia. It was not a gradual blending. It was a shift, abrupt and unmistakable once seen. Wallace began to trace this shift on a map, marking where different species appeared and disappeared. Slowly a boundary emerged, a line that ran between certain islands, separating two distinct groups of animals. What made this discovery so striking was not just the pattern itself, but the geography of the region. The islands on either side of the line were often similar in climate, vegetation, and even size. There was no obvious environmental reason why the animals should differ so dramatically. And yet they did. It must have been a strange feeling, realizing that you were looking at something invisible, something that could not be seen directly but revealed itself through careful observation. There is a particular kind of excitement that comes with noticing a pattern no one else has described, a quiet sense that you are glimpsing a hidden structure in the world. But there is also uncertainty, doubt. The question of whether you might be mistaken, whether the pattern will hold as more evidence is gathered. Wallace did not rush to conclusions. He continued travelling, continued collecting, continued observing, testing his emerging idea against the reality of each new island he visited. Over time, the evidence became overwhelming. The boundary was real. Today it seems obvious when we look at maps showing the distribution of species, but at the time, it was a revelation. It suggested that geography and deep history played a far greater role in shaping life than many had realised. And this realisation did not stand alone. Wallace was also thinking deeply about another question that was beginning to trouble naturalists of his era. The question of how species changed over time. While travelling in the Malay archipelago, Wallace developed ideas about evolution that closely paralleled those of Charles Darwin. In fact, he wrote an essay outlining the principle of natural selection and sent it to Darwin, prompting the joint presentation of their ideas in 1858. It is sometimes easy to forget how remarkable this is. Working independently under challenging conditions, Wallace arrived at one of the central insights of modern biology, that species evolve through the differential survival and reproduction of individuals better adapted to their environments. His observations of island life likely played an important role in shaping these ideas. Islands are natural experiments in evolution, places where isolation and limited resources create conditions in which small changes can accumulate rapidly. When populations are separated by barriers, whether mountains, rivers, or deep ocean channels, they begin to diverge. Over generations, these differences grow, eventually producing entirely new species. The invisible line Wallace identified was not just a curiosity, it was evidence of evolution in action, a demonstration that the distribution of life could not be explained simply by climate or chance. There is something deeply human about the way Wallace worked. He was not driven by the desire for fame or recognition, at least not primarily. His letters and writings reveal a person motivated by wonder, by the sheer fascination of the natural world. Imagine him sitting in the evening after a long day in the field, perhaps in a small wooden hut, listening to insects buzzing in the warm night air, carefully labelling specimens by lamplight. Outside, the forest would be alive with sounds, frogs calling, leaves rustling, distant bird cries fading into the darkness, and in his notebooks, small entries accumulating, dates, locations, descriptions, each one a fragment of a much larger puzzle. It is easy, in the modern world, to forget how much patient science once required, and still does in many ways. Discoveries are often portrayed as sudden breakthroughs, moments of inspiration that arrive fully formed. But more often, they emerge gradually from the steady accumulation of observations, from years of careful work that may seem ordinary at the time. Wallace's recognition of the line that now bears his name was one of those slow discoveries, built not on a single dramatic moment, but on a quiet, persistent attention to detail. There is also something quietly inspiring about the fact that he was not part of the scientific establishment. He was an outsider in many ways, a person who pursued knowledge not because it was expected of him, but because he could not help being curious. Curiosity has a way of carrying people to unexpected places. In Wallace's case, it carried him across thousands of kilometres of ocean, through forests and rivers, across islands where the air smelled of damp earth and salt, where the calls of unfamiliar birds echoed through the canopy, and where each new place offered another piece of the puzzle. It is worth pausing to consider how different the world must have felt then. Travel was slow. Communication was slow. Many regions were still poorly mapped. Each journey into the interior of an island could reveal species unknown to science. There was a sense, perhaps, of the world still being full of secrets waiting to be discovered. And among those secrets was the realization that the living world is shaped not only by the present environment, but by the deep past, by ancient continents and vanished land bridges, by oceans that remained deep while others dried into plains. Wallace could not yet know all the geological details that modern science has uncovered, but he understood the essential point. The boundary he observed was the result of long-term isolation, of regions that had been separated for immense spans of time. It is a testament to the power of careful observation that he could infer so much with so little technology, relying only on what he could see, collect, and compare. His work also reminds us of something important about the nature of discovery. Sometimes, the most significant insights come not from looking for something new, but from looking more closely at what is already there. The islands had existed for millions of years. The animals had lived and evolved there long before Wallace arrived. The line was always present, traced in the distribution of species, waiting for someone to notice it. And noticing, as it turns out, can change the way we see the world. Today, the Wallace Line is taught in biology and geography classes, a clear example of how historical and geological factors shape the distribution of life. It stands as one of the earliest and most compelling pieces of evidence that the Earth's surface and its living inhabitants are part of a single interconnected story. But behind that line is also a story about a person, about long journeys, careful notes, and the quiet satisfaction of understanding something that had once seemed impossible to explain. There is something calming in reflecting on that kind of work. The steady pace, the patience, the willingness to spend years observing before drawing conclusions. It reminds us that understanding does not always come quickly, and that there is value in moving slowly, in paying attention to small details. If you imagine the islands at dusk, the sky deepening to shades of blue and violet, the air cooling slightly after the heat of the day, it is easy to picture Wallace sitting quietly, listening to the sounds of the forest, perhaps turning over in his mind the patterns he had begun to see. Two worlds separated not by distance alone but by time, by ancient seas, by the slow turning of continents. And from that realization, new questions began to emerge. Questions about why the animals differed so sharply, what forces had kept them apart, and what this boundary could teach us about the history of life itself. If you arrived in this part of the world without knowing anything about its history, you might assume that neighbouring islands would share much the same wildlife. It seems like a reasonable expectation. After all, the climate is similar across much of the region. Warm temperatures, seasonal rains, dense forests and rivers winding through green lowlands are common features from one island to the next. Many of the trees even look alike to an untrained eye. Tall trunks rising into layered canopies, vines looping from branch to branch, leaves broad and glossy in the humid air. Standing on a beach and looking across a narrow strait, it is difficult to imagine that the forests on the far shore could hold animals profoundly different from those behind you. The distance is short enough that the hills and mountains are clearly visible. At sunset, the sky fades in the same way on both horizons. The wind carries the same scent of salt and vegetation. And yet, once naturalists began exploring these islands carefully, they realized that similar landscapes can hide entirely different living communities. It is a bit like walking into two houses built with the same floor plan but furnished in completely different ways. The rooms are arranged the same, the windows let in similar light, but the objects inside tell entirely different stories about the people who live there. In the forests on one side of the Wallace Line, mammals familiar to Asia appear in abundance. Monkeys leap through branches, tree shrews scurry along fallen logs, wild pigs root in the undergrowth, small deer move cautiously along forest paths, pausing to listen for danger. Predators such as civets and clouded leopards occupy the higher levels of the food chain. Cross to islands not far away, and many of these animals vanish completely. In their place appear creatures that seem, at first glance, almost like visitors from another continent. Marsupials, for example, begin to appear, mammals whose reproductive strategy differs in a fundamental way from that of placental mammals. Their young are born at a very early stage of development and continue growing in a pouch, nourished and protected in a way that feels unfamiliar if you're accustomed to animals like deer or primates. These marsupials are not identical to kangaroos or wallabies, but they share deep evolutionary roots with them. Their presence reveals that these islands are connected, biologically speaking, to the distant landmass of Australia and New Guinea, rather than to mainland Asia. Birds tell a similar story, though in more subtle ways. Hornbills, barbets, and many species of pheasants dominate forests on the western side. Travel eastward, and you begin to encounter cockatoos, lorikeets, and other birds whose closest relatives live thousands of kilometres away in Australia. The differences extend even to smaller creatures. Insects, reptiles, amphibians, and plants often follow patterns that echo the larger divide. Scientists who examine these groups carefully find the same boundary appearing again and again, like a faint line traced repeatedly across different pages of the same book. What makes this especially intriguing is that the islands themselves often look remarkably similar. Many are volcanic in origin, rising steeply from the sea, their slopes covered in dense forest. Rivers cut through valleys, clouds gather around mountain peaks in the afternoon, releasing brief heavy rains that leave the air cool and fresh for a while, before the warmth returns. If you were placed in the middle of one of these forests without knowing your location, You might not immediately notice which side of the divide you were on. The soil beneath your feet would feel the same, the insects would hum in familiar rhythms, the pattern of daylight filtering through leaves would be almost identical. It's only when you begin to notice the animals themselves that the difference becomes clear. This contrast raises an interesting question. Why do creatures remain so distinct when the environments appear so similar? After all, if the conditions are right, shouldn't species from one island gradually spread to others and establish themselves there? The answer lies in the history of isolation. Over millions of years, populations separated by even modest barriers begin to change. Mutations accumulate. Selection favours traits suited to local conditions. Over time, differences grow larger, until species become distinct enough that they cannot easily replace or compete with those from other regions. Even when dispersal is possible, it does not guarantee success. An animal arriving in a new environment faces many challenges. It may encounter predators it has never evolved to avoid. It may struggle to find familiar food sources. It may fail to reproduce if suitable mates are not present, or if the climate differs in subtle but important ways. For many species, the odds of establishing a new population across a sea barrier are extremely low. Occasional crossings may occur, but successful colonization requires a series of fortunate events aligning over time. As a result, ecosystems on isolated islands often develop in unique ways, shaped by the species that happened to arrive long ago and the evolutionary paths they followed afterward. One of the most fascinating aspects of this process is how quickly differences can accumulate when populations are isolated. On some islands, closely related species evolve into forms adapted to very specific niches, feeding on particular fruits, insects, or seeds, occupying habitats ranging from coastal mangroves to high mountain forests. Isolation acts like a quiet sculptor, shaping life gradually, generation by generation, until the results become unmistakable. If you were to walk slowly through two such forests, one on each side of the Wallace Line, and pay close attention to the details, you might begin to notice patterns that at first seem subtle, but soon become striking. The calls of birds at dawn would differ, not just in pitch, but in rhythm and repetition. The shapes of beaks would reflect different feeding strategies. The mammals glimpsed at dusk would have different body forms, different movements, different ways of navigating the forest floor or canopy. Even the colours of feathers and fur might hint at different evolutionary histories, patterns that developed in response to distinct predators, climates, or mating behaviours. There is something quietly humbling in realising how much history is written into the living world. Every species carries within it a record of its ancestry, a story stretching back through countless generations to ancestors that lived in environments very different from those of today. The forests of these islands are like libraries of those stories, each species a volume containing chapters written over millions of years. And yet these libraries developed separately, shaped by the deep waters that prevented regular contact between their inhabitants. Another interesting feature of island ecosystems is how sensitive they can be to change. Because many species evolved in isolation, they may lack defences against predators or competitors introduced from elsewhere. This is one reason why conservationists are particularly concerned about invasive species on islands, where the arrival of a new predator or herbivore can have dramatic effects. But long before humans began moving species around the globe, natural barriers like deep ocean channels played the role of gatekeepers, determining which species could spread and which would remain confined to their original ranges. It is easy in the modern world to underestimate how powerful such barriers once were. Today, ships and airplanes cross oceans in hours or days. Cargo moves between continents with astonishing speed. Animals and plants are sometimes transported unintentionally, hidden in shipments or ballast water. But for most of Earth's history, oceans were formidable obstacles, especially for land animals. Even relatively short distances could prevent movement for thousands or millions of years. The islands near the Wallace Line illustrate this beautifully. Some are separated by distances that seem trivial on a map. Yet their ecosystems differ as dramatically as those of continents separated by vast oceans. There is also a certain quiet beauty in the idea that the Earth contains hidden boundaries like this, places where history reveals itself not through mountains or rivers, but through patterns of life. If you were to sit quietly on the edge of a forest on one of these islands, perhaps in the late afternoon when the heat begins to ease, you might hear birds calling in the distance, insects buzzing steadily, leaves rustling in a gentle breeze. Nothing about the scene would suggest that the animals around you are part of one of the most distinctive biological regions on the planet, and yet they are, shaped by events that unfolded long before humans existed, by the slow drift of continents, the rise and fall of sea levels, the persistence of deep ocean basins that prevented land bridges from forming. These forces operated silently, over spans of time so vast that they are difficult to imagine. But their effects are visible today in the creatures that inhabit these forests, in the differences that puzzled early naturalists and continue to fascinate scientists. As our understanding of evolution and geology has grown, the explanation for these patterns has become clearer. But there is still something almost magical about the first moment of recognition, the realization that two places so similar in appearance can hold entirely different communities of life. That realization was one of the keys to understanding the broader processes that shape biodiversity across the planet. And it leads naturally to another question, one that early observers also began to ask. If birds can fly and insects can be carried by the wind, why do so many species remain confined to one side of the divide? Why do birds, mammals, and reptiles, creatures capable of movement, often stop at this invisible boundary, as though something unseen were holding them back? It might seem surprising at first that a line drawn across stretches of open water could hold back so many kinds of animals. After all, movement is one of the defining features of life. Birds migrate across continents, mammals swim rivers and sometimes narrow seas, reptiles drift on vegetation, or are carried by storms to new shores. Over long enough periods it feels as though almost any barrier should eventually be crossed. And yet, when scientists began looking carefully at the distribution of species around the Wallace Line, they found that most animals did not cross it, at least not in ways that allowed them to establish lasting populations. A few exceptions appeared, of course, but the overall pattern remained remarkably consistent. Understanding why this happens requires looking at several different factors working together, not just distance or chance, but behaviour, survival, and the quiet constraints of geography and ecology. One of the first things to consider is that crossing water is far more difficult for land animals than it might appear from a map. Even relatively narrow channels can present serious challenges. The currents may be strong, winds can shift suddenly. Salt water is harsh on animals that are not adapted to it, especially mammals that rely on fresh water and have limited tolerance for dehydration. A deer, or a small carnivore that enters the sea, whether intentionally or by accident, has only a limited amount of time before exhaustion sets in. Swimming requires energy, and without a place to rest or drink, survival becomes unlikely. Even animals that are capable swimmers usually depend on rivers or lakes, where fresh water and nearby land offer refuge. Birds, of course, are better equipped to cross water, and some do. But even for birds, dispersal is not as simple as flying in a straight line to a new island and settling there. Many bird species are adapted to specific habitats and food sources. A forest bird may avoid flying long distances over open ocean because it rarely encounters such conditions in its normal life. Navigation cues may be limited. Storms can push birds off course, but those same storms can also leave them exhausted or injured by the time they reach land. And reaching land is only the first step. Survival depends on finding suitable food, shelter, and mates. A single bird arriving alone cannot establish a population. Several individuals must arrive within a relatively short time, survive, and reproduce. That combination of events is rare. Reptiles present another interesting case. Some reptiles, particularly certain lizards and snakes, have been known to colonize islands by rafting on floating vegetation after floods or storms. Because reptiles are often more tolerant of dehydration and can survive longer without food, they sometimes have a better chance of surviving such journeys than mammals. Even so, rafting events depend on a chain of unlikely circumstances. A storm must uproot vegetation large enough to support the animals. The current must carry that vegetation in the right direction. The journey must be short enough for survival, and the landing must occur in a place where the animals can find food and avoid predators. Each of these steps is improbable. Together they become exceedingly rare. Over thousands or millions of years, rare events do happen, and this is why a few species are found on both sides of the Wallace Line. But the number of successful crossings is small compared to the number of species that remain confined to one side. Another factor that plays a role is competition. Imagine a small population of mammals arriving on an island where similar ecological niches are already occupied by well-adapted species. The newcomers must compete for food, territory, and shelter. If they are not better adapted to the local conditions, they may fail to establish themselves, even if the journey itself was successful. This is especially important in tropical ecosystems, where many niches are already filled and competition can be intense. An animal that arrives in a new environment may find that there is simply no place for it in the existing web of life. Predation can also be a powerful barrier. A species that evolved in one region may lack defences against predators in another. Behaviours that worked well in its original habitat may become liabilities in a new one. Over time, natural selection shapes species to fit the specific challenges of their environment, and those adaptations may not transfer easily to unfamiliar settings. Climate, too, can play a subtle role. Even when two islands appear similar, there may be differences in rainfall patterns, seasonal temperatures, or the timing of food availability. These differences may be small, but for specialised species they can make the difference between survival and failure. One of the most important factors, though, lies beneath the surface of the sea itself. The waters marking the Wallace Line are not only deep, but have been deep for a very long time. This depth prevented the formation of land bridges during periods when sea levels were lower. In other parts of the world, such as between Asia and North America, or between Britain and mainland Europe, falling sea levels expose broad areas of land, allowing animals to migrate freely. Here that never happened. The channels remained barriers even at the lower sea levels, maintaining the separation between the faunas of Asia and Australia. This long-term isolation had profound consequences. Species on each side evolved independently for millions of years, adapting to their environments and diversifying into new forms. Over time, the differences became so great that even when occasional crossings occurred, the newcomers were often poorly suited to the ecosystems they encountered. It is interesting to think about how small initial differences can grow over time into large ones. If two populations of animals are separated, even by a modest barrier, they begin to follow different evolutionary paths. Mutations arise randomly, and natural selection favours those that improve survival in each environment. Over many generations, these changes accumulate. Eventually, the populations may become so different that they are no longer compatible. They may look different, behave differently, or occupy entirely different ecological roles. The Wallace Line marks the outcome of this process on a grand scale, a boundary between two evolutionary histories that unfolded separately for immense spans of time. There is also the matter of instinct. Animals do not move randomly across landscapes. They follow patterns shaped by generations of experience and adaptation. Migration routes, feeding habits, and breeding behaviours are often deeply ingrained. A bird species that has never needed to cross open ocean may not do so even if it is physically capable of flight over long distances. In this way, behaviour can reinforce geographic barriers. The sea may not be physically impossible to cross, but it may be avoided simply because it lies outside the normal range of movement for a species. Humans sometimes assume that animals will explore new territories whenever possible, but exploration carries risks. Venturing into unfamiliar environments can mean encountering predators, finding no suitable food, or being unable to navigate back to known territory. Natural selection often favours caution, encouraging behaviours that keep individuals within habitats where survival is more predictable. Another subtle factor is time itself. Even when dispersal is possible, it may take thousands or millions of years for a species to spread significantly beyond its original range. The Wallace Line has existed for such immense spans of time that even slow processes have had time to play out, and yet the boundary remains clear. This persistence suggests that the barrier is not only physical but ecological and evolutionary, reinforced by multiple layers of difficulty that together limit the movement of species. It is worth pausing to imagine how this looks from the perspective of the animals themselves. A bird perched in the canopy of a forest does not know that an invisible line lies beyond the horizon. A lizard basking on a rock does not sense that its species has never crossed to the next island. Each creature simply lives within the world it knows, following instincts shaped by countless generations. And yet, taken together, those individual lives form patterns that stretch across entire regions, patterns that reveal the hidden structure of the natural world. There is something quietly remarkable about that idea, that the movement of small creatures, each concerned only with finding food and avoiding danger, can collectively trace the outlines of ancient continents and vanished seas. Scientists studying these patterns today use tools that Wallace could hardly have imagined: genetic analyses that reveal the relationships between species, satellite imagery that maps landscapes in extraordinary detail, computer models that simulate the movement of populations over time, and yet, the basic observation remains the same. The Wallace Line continues to mark a boundary where many species stop, where two biological worlds meet but do not fully merge. It also reminds us that barriers in nature are often more complex than they appear. A river may seem easy to cross until currents and predators are considered. A mountain pass may look gentle until weather and altitude come into play. And a narrow strait of water may conceal depths and currents that have shaped the course of evolution for millions of years. Far below the surface of the calm tropical seas, far beneath the slow-moving boats and drifting clouds reflected on the water, the shape of the earth tells a story that few people ever see directly. If the ocean could become transparent for a moment, if the water simply faded away and revealed the land beneath, the reason for the Wallace Line would become immediately clear. The seabed in this region is not flat or uniform. It rises and falls in dramatic ways, forming broad, shallow shelves in some places and deep, steep channels in others. These underwater landscapes are the quiet architects of the boundary we've been following, shaping the movement of animals not through visible walls, but through geography hidden under kilometres of water. To understand why deep water matters so much, it helps to imagine the world during the Great Ice Ages. At various times in the past 2 million years, enormous sheets of ice spread across large portions of the northern continents. These glaciers locked away vast amounts of water, causing global sea levels to drop, sometimes by more than 100 metres. When that happened, shallow seas around the world turned into dry land. Coastlines expanded outward, islands became connected to continents, rivers carved valleys across plains that are now submerged. Animals migrated across these temporary bridges, spreading into new territories as the climate shifted. In many parts of the world, these changes reshaped the distribution of life dramatically. Species that had once been isolated came into contact. Populations merged or competed. Entire ecosystems shifted as animals followed expanding grasslands or retreating forests. But in the region of the Wallace Line, something different happened. To the west, the sea floor is relatively shallow. When sea levels fell, large areas of land emerged, connecting what are now islands like Sumatra, Java and Borneo directly to mainland Asia. This exposed landscape, known as Sunderland, formed a vast continuous region of forests, rivers and plains. Animals could move freely across it, just as they would across any other part of a continent. Elephants, rhinoceroses, and large cats once wandered across these plains. monkeys and birds spread through the forests. The boundary between island and mainland disappeared entirely for long stretches of time. But to the east, the story was very different. There, the seafloor drops sharply into deep basins and channels. Even when sea levels fell to their lowest points, these waters remained too deep to expose land bridges. Islands like Sulawesi, Lombok and Flores remained separated by stretches of ocean that animals could not easily cross. This persistent separation meant that the ecosystems on either side continued evolving independently, even during periods when much of the surrounding region was connected by land. It is easy to underestimate how important this difference is. A drop of 100 meters in sea level may sound dramatic, but if a channel is several hundred meters deep, it remains an effective barrier. From the perspective of a land animal, the world beyond that channel is still unreachable. The depth of these waters is not accidental. It reflects the complex geological history of the region, shaped by the slow movement of tectonic plates over millions of years. Southeast Asia sits at the meeting point of several major plates, pieces of the Earth's crust that move slowly but persistently, reshaping continents and oceans. Some plates slide past one another, others collide, forcing one edge downward in a process called subduction. This process creates deep ocean trenches, volcanic arcs, and chains of islands. The islands along the Wallace Line are part of such a dynamic region. Some were formed by volcanic activity, rising from the sea as molten rock cooled and hardened. Others are fragments of older land masses, carried and reshaped by tectonic forces. The deep channels between them are often the result of these same processes, areas where the crust has been pulled apart or pushed downward, creating basins that remain deep even when global sea levels change. These underwater features are invisible to anyone standing on a beach, but they have shaped the course of evolution as surely as mountains and deserts shape life on land. There is something quietly fascinating about the idea that the distribution of animals today depends on the contours of landscapes that few creatures ever see. A deer grazing in a forest has no awareness of the deep trench beneath the sea beyond the horizon, yet that trench may have determined where its ancestors could and could not travel. Over time, these unseen barriers become as effective as walls. Another factor that reinforces the barrier is the nature of the seas themselves. Deep water often means strong currents, driven by differences in temperature, salinity, and the rotation of the Earth. These currents can carry floating objects great distances, but not always in predictable directions. For an animal rafting on vegetation, a favourable current might lead to land, but an unfavourable one might carry it far out to sea, where survival becomes unlikely. Even birds that attempt long flights may encounter shifting winds or storms that alter their course. And then there is the question of timing. Successful colonization requires not just one crossing, but many, enough individuals arriving close enough together in time to establish a breeding population. The deeper and more persistent the barrier, the less often such events occur. Over millions of years, the difference between rare and extremely rare becomes significant. A species that crosses once every few thousand years may spread widely. A species that crosses once every few 100,000 years may leave little or no trace. The Wallace Line reflects this difference in probability, shaped by deep water that reduces the chances of successful dispersal to a very low level. It is also interesting to consider how long these barriers have existed. The tectonic processes that created the deep basins and trenches of this region began tens of millions of years ago, long before the most recent ice ages. This means that the separation between Asian and Australian faunas has deep roots, extending far back into geological time. During those long periods of isolation, species on each side evolved along different paths. Mammals in Australia developed unique adaptations, including marsupial reproduction, and a wide variety of forms that filled ecological roles occupied by placental mammals elsewhere. Birds evolved in distinct lineages, some with remarkable plumage and behaviours found nowhere else on Earth. Meanwhile, the fauna of Asia followed its own course, shaped by connections to Europe and Africa, by shifting climates, and by interactions among large mammals and predators. By the time humans began exploring these regions, the differences had become profound, reflecting millions of years of independent history. What makes the Wallace Line especially compelling is that it preserves this history in a way that is still visible today. Even with occasional crossings and some mixing of species, the overall pattern remains clear, a testament to the enduring influence of ancient geography. There is something calming in reflecting on these immense spans of time. The processes that created this boundary were slow, measured not in years or centuries but in millions of years. Continents drifted at the pace of fingernails growing. Mountains rose grain by grain. Ocean basins deepened gradually as plates shifted beneath one another. From the perspective of a human life, these changes are almost impossible to perceive, and yet they shape the world we inhabit in ways both subtle and profound. If you were to sit quietly on a shoreline near this boundary and watch the tide come in, it might be difficult to imagine that the gentle waves before you conceal depths that have influenced the course of evolution for millions of years. The water would look the same as any other tropical sea, shimmering under the sun, reflecting the sky, moving in slow, steady rhythms. But beneath that surface lies a landscape as varied and dramatic as any mountain range, with ridges, slopes, and valleys that have guided the movement of life in ways no creature could consciously perceive. This hidden geography also reminds us that the Earth is not static. The continents continue to move, slowly but steadily. Sea levels rise and fall in response to climate changes. Volcanic islands emerge and erode. Over millions of years, the configuration of land and sea will change again, creating new barriers and new connections. In the distant future, the Wallace Line as we know it may no longer exist, just as ancient boundaries of the past have disappeared. But for now, it remains one of the clearest examples of how the physical structure of the planet shapes the distribution of life. When we look at a modern map, the oceans seem permanent and unchanging, vast blue expanses that feel as though they have always been there. Coastlines appear fixed, islands appear isolated. It is easy to assume that the geography we see today has always looked more or less the same, but the Earth has a long memory, and its surface has changed again and again in ways that are difficult to imagine, unless we slow down and think in spans of tens of thousands, or even hundreds of thousands of years. There were times, not so very long ago in geological terms, when the world was colder than it is today. Winters were longer, summers were cooler. Great sheets of ice spread across large portions of North America, Europe and Asia, sometimes reaching thicknesses of several kilometers. These glaciers grew slowly, year by year, century by century, as snowfall accumulated faster than it melted, and as those immense fields of ice expanded, something subtle but powerful began to happen to the oceans. Water that would normally flow through rivers and seas became locked in ice. Not a small amount, but enough to lower global sea levels by more than 100 meters. Shorelines shifted outward. Continental shelves that are now underwater became dry land. Entire regions that are seas today were once plains where animals walked, plants grew, and rivers wound their way toward distant coasts. These periods, known collectively as the Ice Ages, transformed the geography of the planet in ways that shaped the movement of species and the history of ecosystems across the world. In Southeast Asia, the changes were especially dramatic. To the west of the Wallace Line, the shallow seas receded, exposing enormous stretches of land that connected islands we now think of as separate. Sumatra, Java and Borneo were no longer islands at all. They became part of a vast peninsula extending from mainland Asia, a continuous region of forests, grasslands and rivers that scientists now call Sunderland. It is difficult to picture just how large this landmass was. If you stood on a hill in what is now Borneo during one of the colder periods, you would not have seen the ocean stretching in every direction. Instead, you might have seen forests extending far beyond the present coastlines. merging with landscapes that today lie hidden beneath the South China Sea and the Java Sea. Animals moved freely across this landscape. Elephants wandered through valleys that are now submerged. Herds of deer grazed on plains where fish now swim. Predators followed their prey across territories that spanned what are today multiple countries and islands. For the creatures living there was no boundary between mainland and island, because the sea had withdrawn, revealing land that had always been there, waiting quietly beneath the waves. And yet, only a short distance away, a different reality existed. To the east, deep channels remained filled with water. Even at the lower sea levels, these basins did not dry out. Islands such as Lombok and Sulawesi remained separated from the western lands by stretches of ocean that animals could not easily cross. This contrast created one of the most important conditions for the Wallace Line. On one side, land bridges appeared and disappeared as the climate shifted, allowing animals to spread widely. On the other, isolation persisted, maintaining the separation between ecosystems that had evolved along different paths. The ice ages did not occur just once. They came and went in cycles, each lasting tens of thousands of years. Glaciers advanced and retreated, sea levels fell and rose. Land bridges appeared and vanished again, sometimes more than once. During colder periods, Sunderland expanded, becoming a vast connected region. During warmer periods, the glaciers melted, the oceans rose, and the land bridges disappeared, isolating populations that had once been connected. This repeated cycle had profound effects on evolution. When populations are connected, genes flow between them, maintaining similarities. When populations become isolated, differences begin to accumulate. Over time, these differences can lead to the formation of new species. In this way, the shifting coastlines of the ice ages acted like a slow rhythmic pulse, alternately connecting and separating populations, shaping the diversity of life across the region. It is interesting to imagine what these landscapes might have looked like at the height of one of the glacial periods. The climate in Southeast Asia would still have been warm compared to the frozen north, but cooler and drier than today. Forests may have given way in some areas to open woodlands or grasslands. Rivers would have flowed across plains that are now seabeds, carrying sediment toward coastlines far beyond the modern shore. Animals would have followed these changing environments, moving gradually as habitats shifted. Migration would not have been a sudden event, but a slow expansion of ranges over generations, each generation moving a little farther than the last. And then, as the climate warmed again, the glaciers melted. Water returned to the oceans. The plains flooded. Valleys filled with seawater, forming straits and channels. Hills became islands. Populations that had once been connected found themselves separated once more. For many species, this isolation was permanent. They adapted to their local environments, evolving into forms suited to the specific conditions of each island. This pattern of connection and isolation helps explain why islands in this region often host unique species found nowhere else on Earth. Each island became, in a sense, a small world of its own, shaped by its history of connection and separation. But the Wallace Line remained a constant boundary through all these changes. The deep channels marking its course never became dry land, even at the lower sea levels. While animals could walk across Sunderland, they could not cross into the lands connected to Australia and New Guinea. To the south and east, another great landmass existed during the Ice Ages, known as Sahul. Australia and New Guinea were connected by land, forming a continuous region where marsupials, birds and reptiles spread across varied landscapes ranging from deserts to rainforests. This meant that two vast biological worlds existed side by side, separated by relatively narrow but persistent stretches of deep water. It is remarkable to think that a difference in seafloor depth of a few hundred meters could shape the course of evolution for millions of years. Yet that is precisely what happened. The Ice Ages also influenced ocean currents and climate patterns, which in turn affected the distribution of plants and animals. Changes in rainfall altered the extent of forests and grasslands. Rivers shifted their courses, lakes expanded and contracted. These environmental changes created opportunities for some species to expand their ranges and challenges for others, further shaping the ecosystems of the region. Another fascinating aspect of this history is how it reveals the interconnectedness of Earth's systems. Climate, geology, oceanography, and biology all interacted to produce the patterns we see today. No single factor alone can explain the Wallace Line. It is the result of many processes acting together over immense spans of time. There is something quietly humbling in reflecting on these processes. The rise and fall of sea levels, the slow drift of continents, the advance and retreat of glaciers all occurred long before humans existed, and they will continue long after our own brief moment in history has passed. And yet, by studying the patterns of life and the shape of the land, we can glimpse this deep history, reading it like a story written in coastlines and fossils and the distribution of species. If you were to stand on the shore of one of these islands at sunset, watching the tide move slowly in or out, it might be difficult to imagine that the water before you once lay far beyond the horizon, or that the seabed beneath the waves was once dry land where animals walked. But the Earth has changed in ways both subtle and profound, and those changes have left their mark on every forest, every reef, every creature living today. As scientists continued to study these patterns, they began to realize that not all animals were equally limited by the barriers of deep water. Some species managed to cross, though rarely, and their presence offers valuable clues about how dispersal occurs and why certain groups succeed where others do not. If you were able to travel back in time far enough, to an era when the climate of the Earth was colder and the oceans were lower, the map of Southeast Asia would look surprisingly unfamiliar. Coastlines would stretch far beyond their present boundaries, and many of the islands we recognise today would not appear as islands at all. Instead, they would form parts of two enormous land masses, each with its own landscapes, rivers, forests, and communities of animals. These lost lands are known today as Sundaland and Sahul, and understanding them is essential to understanding the invisible boundary we have been following. Let's begin with Sundaland. Picture the Asian mainland extending far to the south, not stopping at the modern shores of Thailand or Vietnam, but continuing outward across what are now shallow seas. The islands of Sumatra, Borneo and Java would be joined together into a single continuous landscape. Wide river systems would flow across plains that today lie hidden beneath the waters of the South China Sea and the Java Sea. Forests would cover vast areas, broken in places by open grasslands and wetlands. From the perspective of an animal living there, this would not feel like a collection of islands. It would feel like a continent. Elephants could roam across immense distances without encountering the sea. Tigers could follow prey along river valleys that now exist only in geological records. Troops of monkeys could spread through forests that stretched for hundreds of kilometres without interruption. This was Sundaland, not an island chain, but a broad extension of Asia itself, exposed whenever sea levels dropped during the ice ages. The existence of this landmass explains why so many animals on the western side of the Wallace Line closely resemble those of mainland Asia. Their ancestors did not need to cross oceans. They simply moved across land, gradually expanding their ranges as habitats allowed. Over thousands of generations, populations spread, adapted to local conditions, and sometimes became new species. But the overall character of the fauna remained recognisably Asian, because the land itself was part of Asia. Now imagine travelling southeast from this great plain, walking for days or weeks through forests and grasslands, eventually reaching the edge of the land where the ground sloped downward toward the sea. Across the water, visible on a clear day, might be the outline of another landmass, distant but real. That land belonged to a different world. This was Sahul. During periods of low sea level, Australia, New Guinea and Tasmania were joined together into a single continent. Wide coastal plains extended far beyond modern shorelines. Rivers flowed across regions that now submerged beneath the Arafura Sea. Forests covered parts of New Guinea, while vast open landscapes stretched across much of Australia. Animals moved freely within this connected landmass, spreading across environments that range from tropical rainforest to arid interior. Marsupials diversified into many forms, filling ecological roles that placental mammals occupied elsewhere in the world. Birds evolved in isolation, developing lineages found nowhere else. Sahul was not a small or insignificant region. It was a continent in its own right, with its own evolutionary history unfolding over millions of years. And between Sunderland and Sahul lay a series of deep ocean channels that never became dry land, even when sea levels were at their lowest. Those channels formed the persistent barrier that prevented most animals from crossing between the two continents. It is remarkable to think that during the Ice Ages, the distance between these land masses was often much smaller than it is today. Sea levels dropped by more than 100 metres, exposing vast areas of continental shelf. Yet the deepest channels remained submerged, creating a narrow but effective barrier that separated two great biological worlds. If you could stand at the eastern edge of Sunderland during one of those glacial periods and look towards Sahul, the gap might not seem especially large. On a clear day, you might even see distant land on the horizon. But for most land animals, even a narrow stretch of open ocean is an insurmountable obstacle. The importance of this separation becomes clearer when we think about time. Sunderland and Sahul were not briefly isolated. They were separated in various forms for tens of millions of years. That is long enough for entire branches of the tree of life to evolve independently, producing ecosystems that differ in fundamental ways. Marsupials, for example, became dominant mammals in Sahul, while placental mammals dominated Sunderland and the rest of Asia. These differences were not simply superficial. They reflected deep evolutionary histories, shaped by millions of years of adaptation to different environments and ecological interactions. When occasional crossings did occur, they were rare and often limited in their impact. A few species of birds or reptiles might establish populations, but the overall character of the ecosystems remained distinct. Another aspect of Sunderland and Sahul that is easy to overlook is how dynamic these landscapes were. The Ice Ages did not produce a single static configuration of land and sea. Instead, coastlines shifted repeatedly as glaciers advanced and retreated. At times, Sunderland expanded to its greatest extent, forming a continuous landmass that stretched far beyond modern coastlines. At other times, rising seas flooded low-lying areas, fragmenting the land into islands once more. The same was true of Sahul. Coastal plains appeared and disappeared. Rivers changed course. Habitats shifted as climates fluctuated. These changes influenced the movement and evolution of species in subtle but important ways. Populations that were once connected became isolated. Isolated populations sometimes evolved into new species. When connections reappeared, some species spread again, while others remained confined to particular regions. Over many cycles, these processes created a complex mosaic of biodiversity, with some species widely distributed and others found only in small areas. There is something quietly fascinating about imagining these vanished landscapes. The seabed beneath modern waters holds the remains of ancient river channels, floodplains and forests, preserved in sediments that record the history of changing climates and sea levels. If those landscapes could be restored, even briefly, we would see herds of animals moving across plains where fishing boats now drift, forests growing where coral reefs now flourish, and rivers flowing through valleys hidden beneath the sea. The Earth we see today is only one version of a landscape that has changed again and again over time. Thinking about Sunderland and Sahul also reminds us how closely life is tied to geography. The shape of continents, the depth of seas, and the rise and fall of sea levels all influence where species can live and how they evolve. These processes operate slowly, almost imperceptibly on human timescales, but their effects accumulate over millions of years, shaping the distribution of life in ways that become unmistakable when viewed from a broader perspective. It is also worth reflecting on how recent these changes are in geological terms. The last glacial maximum, when sea levels were at their lowest, occurred only about 20,000 years ago. That may sound like a very long time, but in the context of evolution, it is relatively recent. Humans were already present in many parts of the world at that time. Early human populations moved across landscapes that no longer exist, following coastlines that are now submerged, crossing regions that have since become seas. In fact, humans themselves eventually crossed the narrow channels separating Sundaland and Sahel, reaching Australia tens of thousands of years ago. This required some form of watercraft, suggesting that even early humans recognized the barrier posed by open water and developed ways to overcome it. Most other land animals, of course, did not have that advantage. The persistence of the Wallace Line reflects this difference. For millions of years, animals without the ability to build boats or navigate open seas remained confined to their respective continents, evolving along separate paths. There is something quietly humbling about the idea that the presence or absence of a few hundred meters of water can shape the course of evolution on a continental scale. And yet, this is not unique to Southeast Asia. Similar patterns occur elsewhere in the world, wherever deep water or other barriers prevent the formation of land bridges. What makes Sundaland and Sahel especially striking is how close these two great landmasses once came to one another, and how clearly their separation is reflected in the living world today. If you could walk across Sundaland at the height of an ice age, you might encounter forests filled with animals familiar to Asia. If you could then cross the narrow seas and walk across Sahul, you would find yourself in a landscape inhabited by creatures that belong to a completely different evolutionary tradition. Two continents, two histories, separated not by vast oceans but by a barrier narrow enough to be seen across on a clear day, yet deep enough to persist through ages of changing climate. If Sundaland and a Sahul were once such extensive landmasses, and if the seas between them were sometimes relatively narrow, were there any animals that managed to cross despite the barrier? And if so, how did they do it? From a distance, the sea between these islands can look calm and almost inviting. The surface glimmers in the sunlight, waves moving in gentle rhythms, the horizon often clear enough that land appears faintly in the distance. It is easy to imagine that crossing such water might not be especially difficult, especially over the course of thousands or millions of years. And yet, the pattern of life in this region tells a different story. Most animals did not cross the invisible boundary between the great land masses we have been describing. Entire groups remained confined to one side or the other, evolving in isolation while their counterparts on the opposite shore followed entirely separate paths. But not every species remained separated. A few managed to cross, and those rare crossings provide some of the most fascinating clues about how dispersal works and why it usually fails. To understand this, it helps to think about movement in terms of probability rather than possibility. Many events in nature are possible, but extremely unlikely. A tree branch might fall in a storm and land in such a way that it forms a natural raft. A small animal might be stranded on it. Currents might carry that raft across open water. The animal might survive the journey and reach another island. Each of these steps is possible, but the chances of all of them happening in sequence are very small. And even then, survival after arrival is not guaranteed. Most animals that reach a new place do not establish a population. They may be alone, they may be unable to find food, they may encounter predators or diseases to which they have no resistance. Establishing a population requires multiple individuals, arriving within a time frame that allows reproduction and growth. This is why successful colonization events are rare, even over long spans of time. Birds are among the animals most likely to cross such barriers, and this is one reason why bird distributions sometimes appear less sharply divided than those of mammals. Many birds are capable of long-distance flight, and some migrate across vast oceans every year. Storms can also carry birds far beyond their normal ranges, depositing them on distant shores. But even birds are limited by behaviour and ecology. Many species are strongly tied to particular habitats and may avoid flying over open water. Forest birds, for example, often prefer to remain within sight of trees, and long stretches of ocean can be disorienting or dangerous. Those that do arrive must still find suitable conditions. If the local vegetation differs, or if competitors already occupy similar niches, survival may be difficult. Reptiles provide some of the clearest examples of successful crossings. Certain lizards and snakes have been known to disperse by rafting on vegetation. Because reptiles generally have lower metabolic rates than mammals and can survive longer without food, they may endure journeys that would be fatal to other animals. Eggs, too, can sometimes survive short periods of exposure to salt water, especially if protected within floating debris. This increases the chances that a small population might establish itself after a rafting event. Insects and plants often cross barriers more easily than larger animals. Seeds may be carried by wind or birds, or drift on ocean currents. Insects may be blown across water by storms. These forms of dispersal, while still uncertain, occur often enough over long periods to allow many species to spread widely. Mammals, by contrast, are among the least likely to cross open ocean successfully. Most require regular access to fresh water and are sensitive to dehydration. They are also often less tolerant of prolonged exposure to sun and salt spray. Even strong swimmers face enormous challenges when attempting to cross open sea. This helps explain why the mammals of Sunderland and Sahul remained so distinct for so long. The barrier was simply too difficult for most species to overcome. There is also the matter of timing. Rare events may allow a species to cross once, but for a stable population to form, conditions must be favourable not just once but repeatedly. A single individual or pair may survive for a time but fail to reproduce successfully. Without a steady flow of newcomers or a sufficiently large founding population, extinction is likely. This is sometimes called the founder effect, where small populations that do establish themselves may differ genetically from their source populations, leading to rapid evolutionary change. But reaching that point requires overcoming significant obstacles. Another important factor is ecological balance. Ecosystems are complex networks of relationships among species. A newcomer must find a role within this network, obtaining food, avoiding predators, and reproducing successfully. If similar niches are already filled by well-adapted species, the newcomer may be outcompeted. This is especially true in tropical regions, where biodiversity is high and ecological niches are often finely divided. Competition for resources can be intense, leaving little room for new arrivals. Predators also play a role. An animal that evolved in an environment without certain predators may be vulnerable when encountering them for the first time. Conversely, a predator arriving in a new ecosystem may find that its usual prey is absent, making survival difficult. These ecological interactions help maintain the distinct character of ecosystems even when occasional dispersal occurs. It is interesting to consider how long it takes for such patterns to emerge. Over millions of years, even very rare events can happen, and yet the Wallace Line remains one of the most persistent boundaries in the distribution of life. This suggests that the combination of physical barriers, ecological challenges, and evolutionary history is powerful enough to maintain separation over immense spans of time. There are, however, a few notable examples of animals that did manage to cross. Some species of bats, for instance, are found on both sides of the divide. Their ability to fly long distances and their nocturnal habits may make them more capable of surviving ocean crossings than many birds. Certain rodents have also managed to disperse between islands, likely by rafting. These species often show genetic evidence of relatively recent colonization events, suggesting that such crossings, while rare, do occur. Birds, reptiles and insects show various patterns of distribution that reflect occasional dispersal combined with long periods of isolation. Each group tells a slightly different story, shaped by its own biology and behaviour. These exceptions are important because they remind us that barriers in nature are rarely absolute. They are filters rather than walls, allowing some species to pass while stopping others. The Wallace Line functions as one of the most effective filters on Earth, separating two major faunal regions while still permitting a limited amount of exchange. There is something quietly fascinating about the role of chance in these processes. A storm at the right moment, a current flowing in the right direction, a group of animals finding themselves on floating vegetation. Any of these events might lead to a successful crossing that changes the history of a species. And yet chance alone is not enough. Survival and reproduction must follow, and those depend on the intricate interplay of environment, competition, and adaptation. Over long periods, these rare events add small threads to the tapestry of life, but the overall pattern remains shaped by the larger forces of geography and deep time. It is also worth reflecting on how different the world might look if these barriers had not existed. If land bridges had connected Sunderland and Sahul, the distinct faunas of Asia and Australia might have mixed extensively. Marsupials might have faced competition from placental mammals much earlier, perhaps altering the course of their evolution. Birds and reptiles might have spread more widely, reducing the sharpness of the boundary we see today. The uniqueness of many species in Australia and New Guinea owes much to this long isolation, preserved by deep water that prevented widespread mixing. Separation is a quiet force. It does not roar like a storm or split the land with earthquakes. Most of the time it works so slowly that no single creature ever notices it happening. A forest remains a forest. A coastline looks much the same from one generation to the next. Animals continue feeding, breeding, and moving through their territories as they always have. And yet, beneath that calm continuity, something gradual and powerful unfolds. When populations of living things become isolated, evolution begins to follow different paths. To understand why, it helps to picture a species not as a fixed, unchanging form, but as a flowing river of generations. Each generation resembles the one before it, but never perfectly. Small variations appear, differences in size, colour, behaviour, tolerance to heat or cold, the ability to digest certain foods or resist particular diseases. These variations are natural, arising from the subtle reshuffling of genetic material and occasional mutations. In a large connected population, these variations mix freely. Individuals from different regions interbreed, and genes spread widely. Differences that arise in one area are diluted by the constant exchange with others. Over time, the population remains relatively uniform, even across large distances. But when a population becomes isolated, the situation changes. Imagine a group of animals living on an island that becomes separated from the mainland as sea levels rise. At first, the animals on both sides remain very similar. They share the same ancestors, the same general characteristics. But as generations pass, small differences begin to accumulate. Perhaps the island has fewer predators, and animals that are slightly bolder survive and reproduce more successfully. Perhaps the food sources differ, favouring individuals with slightly different feeding behaviours. Perhaps the climate is a bit wetter or drier, favouring subtle changes in physiology. None of these changes happen suddenly. They unfold over many generations, often so gradually that no single step stands out. But over hundreds or thousands of generations, the cumulative effect becomes significant. The isolated population begins to look and behave differently from its relatives elsewhere. This process is called evolution in isolation, and it is one of the most powerful engines of biodiversity on Earth. Islands, in particular, provide ideal conditions for this process. Their boundaries limit movement, reducing gene flow between populations. Their environments often differ in ways that create unique selective pressures, and their relatively small size means that chance events can have large effects. One well-known pattern that emerges on islands is called island gigantism or dwarfism. Some species become larger than their mainland relatives, while others become smaller. These changes often reflect differences in predators, competition, and available resources. For example, in environments where predators are absent, small animals may evolve to become larger because they no longer need to remain small and hidden. Conversely, large animals may become smaller if resources are limited because smaller bodies require less food. These changes can happen surprisingly quickly in evolutionary terms, sometimes within a few tens of thousands of years. Isolation also encourages specialization. On a large continent, many species may compete for similar resources, leading to intense competition. On an isolated island, fewer competitors may be present, allowing species to expand into niches that would be unavailable elsewhere. Over time, this can lead to remarkable diversity. A single ancestral species may give rise to many descendants, each adapted to a specific diet or habitat. Birds may evolve different beak shapes suited to different foods. Insects may specialize in particular plants. Reptiles may adapt to life in trees, on rocks, or along shorelines. Each adaptation reflects the unique conditions of the environment in which it evolved. In the regions separated by the Wallace Line, this process unfolded over millions of years. Sunderland and Sahul, though sometimes closer together than they are today, remained largely isolated by deep water. Their ecosystems developed independently, shaped by different climates, different competitors, and different histories. Marsupials in Sahul diversified into forms that filled roles occupied by placental mammals elsewhere. Some became grazers, others predators, still others burrowers or climbers. Birds evolved elaborate plumage and behaviours influenced by the specific ecological interactions of their environments. Meanwhile, in Sunderland, placental mammals diversified in their own ways, interacting with species that had evolved in connection with the broader Asian continent. These parallel histories created two biological worlds that were distinct not only in species, but in underlying evolutionary patterns. It is interesting to consider how long such differences take to develop. Evolution does not proceed at a constant rate. Some lineages change rapidly when environments shift or new opportunities arise. Others remain relatively stable for long periods, but over millions of years, even small differences accumulate into profound divergence. Species that once shared common ancestors become so different that their relationships are not obvious without careful study. Genetic research has made it possible to trace these relationships with remarkable precision. By comparing DNA, scientists can estimate how long ago different species diverged and reconstruct the pathways of evolution. These studies often confirm what early naturalists inferred from observation alone, that the faunas of Asia and Australia have been separated for immense spans of time, long enough for entire groups of animals to follow distinct evolutionary trajectories. Isolation also affects behaviour. Animals adapt not only physically, but also in the ways they interact with their environment and with each other. Mating displays, feeding strategies, and social structures may all change over time in response to local conditions. Birds on isolated islands, for example, sometimes lose their fear of predators if those predators are absent. Over many generations, behaviours that were once essential for survival may fade, replaced by new patterns better suited to the local environment. Such changes can be beneficial in stable conditions, but may leave species vulnerable if new predators arrive. A reminder that evolution is not about perfection, but about adaptation to specific circumstances. Another important consequence of isolation is the development of endemic species, organisms found nowhere else on Earth. Many islands near the Wallace Line host such species, each representing a unique evolutionary experiment shaped by local conditions and long separation. Endemic species often have small populations and limited ranges, making them particularly sensitive to environmental change, but they also provide valuable insights into the processes of evolution. illustrating how quickly and creatively life can adapt when given the opportunity. There is something quietly remarkable about walking through a forest and realizing that many of the creatures around you exist nowhere else in the world, that their ancestors arrived long ago and followed a path of change that occurred only in that place. It reminds us that biodiversity is not just a collection of species but a record of history, written in living forms. The role of isolation in shaping life is not limited to islands. Mountains, rivers, deserts, and even climatic zones can create barriers that separate populations. Over time, these barriers produce patterns of diversity similar to those seen across the Wallace Line. But the clarity of the Wallace Line makes it one of the most striking examples, a boundary where the effects of isolation are visible across entire faunas. Reflecting on these processes also invites us to think about time in a different way. Human lives are measured in decades, perhaps a century at most. Evolution operates over thousands, millions, sometimes tens of millions of years. Changes that seem instantaneous in geological terms are far beyond the scale of human experience. Yet the results of those changes surround us, in every forest, every coral reef, every field. The animals living today are the latest chapters in stories that began long before humans appeared. Stories shaped by drifting continents, rising mountains, and the slow rhythm of climate cycles. Isolation is one of the threads that runs through those stories, guiding the direction of change, creating diversity, and preserving distinct lineages that might otherwise have blended together. It is also worth remembering that isolation is rarely absolute. Occasionally species do cross barriers, as we discussed earlier. When they do, they sometimes introduce new genes, new behaviours, or new ecological interactions that alter the course of evolution. These rare events add complexity to the patterns we observe, reminding us that nature is rarely simple or predictable. The Wallace Line itself is not a perfect boundary. Some species occur on both sides, and transitional zones exist where elements of both faunas appear. But the overall pattern remains clear, reflecting the dominant influence of long-term isolation. Not every boundary in the natural world announces itself clearly. Some are marked by mountains rising sharply into the sky, or deserts stretching for hundreds of kilometres, or oceans so vast that no land is visible in any direction. Those are easy to recognise, but many of the most important divisions on Earth are quiet ones, places where the landscape changes only subtly, yet the living world shifts in ways that reveal an invisible border, much like the one we've been exploring. The Wallace Line is one of the most famous examples, but it is far from the only one. Once scientists began to understand how geography, climate, and deep time shape the distribution of species, they started noticing similar patterns in other parts of the world. Each boundary has its own story, but they all share a common theme. Life is shaped not only by what is visible, but by histories written in land, water, and time. One such boundary runs through the Americas, though it is less sharply defined than the Wallace Line. It lies near the Isthmus of Panama, the narrow strip of land that connects North and South America. Today, animals move freely across this land bridge, but for most of Earth's history, the two continents were separated by ocean. North America had its own distinct fauna, shaped by connections to Eurasia, while South America evolved in relative isolation, producing unique mammals such as giant ground sloths, glyptodonts, and marsupial predators. When the Isthmus of Panama finally rose above the sea around 3 million years ago, the two faunas began to mix in what scientists call the Great American Biotic Interchange. Some species spread successfully, while others did not. The patterns of survival and extinction that followed reveal how powerful long-term isolation can be, and how disruptive it can be when barriers disappear. Another invisible boundary appears in Africa, not marked by mountains or rivers, but by climate. The Sahara Desert forms a vast region of extreme aridity that separates the ecosystems of North Africa from those of sub-Saharan Africa. For many species, this desert is an effective barrier, preventing the movement of animals and plants between regions that might otherwise share similar climates. And yet, the Sahara has not always been a desert. During wetter periods in the past, grasslands and lakes spread across parts of what is now barren sand, allowing animals to move between regions. When the climate changed and the desert returned, populations became isolated once more, and their evolutionary paths diverged. These shifting climatic boundaries remind us that barriers are not always permanent. They can appear and disappear as conditions change, leaving lasting marks on the distribution of life. In the oceans, invisible boundaries are often created by temperature and currents rather than land. Marine species are sensitive to differences in water temperature, salinity, and nutrient availability. Warm tropical waters support different communities than cold polar seas, and the transitions between these regions can be surprisingly sharp. One example is the boundary between tropical and temperate marine ecosystems, where coral reefs give way to kelp forests and other cold water habitats. Fish, invertebrates, and even microscopic plankton may be confined to one side of these temperature gradients, their distribution shaped by physiological limits that are not immediately visible to us. Ocean currents can also act as barriers. Some currents form stable patterns that prevent larvae or drifting organisms from crossing into neighbouring regions. Over time, populations separated by these currents may diverge, forming distinct species even though no physical barrier is present. On land, mountain ranges often create invisible boundaries by altering climate and vegetation. The Andes in South America, for example, separate ecosystems on their eastern and western slopes, with different rainfall patterns, temperatures, and species communities. Animals adapted to one side may find the other unsuitable, even if the distance across the mountains is not great. Similarly, the Himalayas form a boundary between the ecosystems of the Indian subcontinent and those of Central Asia. The high elevations, cold temperatures, and thin air create conditions that many species cannot tolerate, effectively isolating populations and shaping patterns of biodiversity. Rivers too can act as barriers, particularly for small animals and plants with limited dispersal abilities. In the Amazon basin, some large rivers separate populations of monkeys, birds, and insects, leading to the evolution of closely related species on opposite banks. To a human observer, a river may appear easy to cross, but for many forest-dwelling animals, the open water and lack of suitable habitat in the middle create a formidable obstacle. What these examples have in common is that the boundaries are not always obvious at first glance. They reveal themselves through patterns in the living world, through the presence of certain species and the absence of others, through subtle differences that become clear only when observed carefully over time. This is one of the reasons why the study of biogeography, the distribution of life across space and time, is so fascinating. It combines geology, climate science, ecology, and evolutionary biology, weaving together multiple threads to explain why life is arranged as it is. There is also something quietly satisfying about recognizing these patterns. Once you know they exist, you begin to see them everywhere, in the way plant communities change with altitude, in the way bird species differ between islands, in the way certain insects appear only in particular habitats. The world becomes not just a collection of places, but a mosaic of histories, each region shaped by its own combination of barriers and connections. Invisible boundaries also remind us that ecosystems are dynamic. They are not fixed or permanent. Climate change, tectonic activity, and human influence can alter or erase barriers, sometimes with dramatic consequences. When barriers disappear, species that were once isolated may come into contact, leading to competition, hybridization, or extinction. When new barriers arise, populations may become separated, beginning the slow process of divergence that can eventually lead to new species. These processes are happening continuously, though often too slowly to notice within a human lifetime. Reflecting on this can change the way we think about the natural world. It encourages us to see landscapes not as static scenes, but as stages in an ongoing story, shaped by forces that operate over timescales far longer than our own lives. The Wallace Line is a particularly clear example of this story, but it is part of a much larger pattern, one that extends across continents and oceans, linking the history of life to the history of the Earth itself. Long before genetics laboratories, satellite mapping and computer models, understanding how life changed over time depended largely on observation. Naturalists watched carefully, compared specimens, and tried to make sense of patterns that at first seemed disconnected. One of the most powerful lessons to emerge from these observations came from the invisible boundary we have been exploring, because it revealed something that was not obvious before. The distribution of animals is not random, and it is not determined only by climate or vegetation. It is shaped by history, by movement, and by separation over immense spans of time. This realization played an important role in strengthening one of the central ideas of modern biology, the idea that species evolve. To see why this mattered so much, it helps to imagine what many people believed before such evidence accumulated. In the early 19th century, a common view was that species were fixed, created in their present forms and distributed across the world according to conditions suited to them. If a forest in one region resembled a forest in another, it seemed reasonable to expect that the animals would be similar as well. But the Wallace Line challenged that assumption in a very clear way. On either side of the boundary, the climate is broadly similar. Tropical forests grow in both regions. Temperatures and rainfall patterns overlap, and yet the animals differ dramatically. Mammals, birds, reptiles and insects belong to entirely different lineages, many with closer relatives thousands of kilometers away than on nearby islands. If climate alone determined the distribution of species, this pattern would be difficult to explain. But if species evolve from common ancestors and spread gradually across land, then the pattern begins to make sense. Populations separated by barriers follow different evolutionary paths, shaped by their environments and by chance events over time. The Wallace Line provided a clear, almost striking example of this principle in action. It showed that isolation is not just a minor detail in the history of life, but one of the most powerful forces shaping it. When populations are separated, differences accumulate. Over time, these differences can become so great that entirely new species arise, each adapted to its own conditions and history. This idea, which now seems familiar, was once revolutionary. It required people to think of species not as static forms but as dynamic populations, constantly changing, influenced by geography, climate, and the passage of time. Another important lesson from the Wallace Line concerns the role of deep time in shaping the living world. The differences between the faunas of Asia and Australia did not arise quickly. They reflect millions of years of separation, during which entire groups of animals diversified in different directions. Marsupials in Australia evolved to fill ecological roles occupied by placental mammals elsewhere. Birds developed distinct lineages. Reptiles and insects followed their own evolutionary paths. These changes unfolded gradually, generation by generation, long before humans appeared. The boundary between these faunas is therefore not just a line on a map. It is a record of ancient geological events, of continents drifting, seas deepening, and climates changing over immense spans of time. This connection between geology and biology was another important insight reinforced by the study of the Wallace Line. It became clear that to understand the distribution of life, one must also understand the history of the Earth itself. Mountains, rivers, deserts, and oceans are not just features of the landscape. They are forces that shape evolution, guiding the movement of species and determining which populations remain connected and which become isolated. This realization helped give rise to the field of biogeography, which studies how species are distributed across space and time. Biogeography combines evidence from fossils, genetics, geology, and ecology to reconstruct the history of life on Earth. The Wallace Line became one of the most famous examples used in this field. because it illustrates so clearly how geography and evolution interact. There is also an important lesson here about the nature of scientific discovery. The boundary we now call the Wallace Line was not revealed by a single experiment or a sudden insight. It emerged from careful observation, from the patient work of comparing species across many islands, from the willingness to notice patterns that others had overlooked. This reminds us that science often advances not through dramatic breakthroughs alone, but through steady, thoughtful attention to detail. Another lesson concerns the importance of chance in evolution. The species that exist in a particular region are not determined solely by environmental conditions. They also reflect historical accidents, which species happened to arrive, which survived, which went extinct. If different species had crossed the deep channels separating Sundaland and Sahel millions of years ago, the ecosystems of both regions might look very different today. Evolution does not follow a predetermined path. It is shaped by events that are often unpredictable, though their consequences become clear in hindsight. The Wallace Line also illustrates how barriers can act as filters rather than absolute walls. Some species do manage to cross, particularly birds, bats, and certain reptiles. But the number of successful crossings is small compared to the number of species that remain confined to one side. This filtering effect helps explain why certain groups of animals are widely distributed, while others are more localized. It also shows how even small differences in dispersal ability can have large effects over long periods of time. For example, birds that are strong flyers may spread across islands more easily than ground-dwelling mammals. Seeds carried by wind or birds may colonize new areas more readily than plants that rely on other methods of dispersal. These differences influence not only the distribution of species, but also the structure of entire ecosystems. Another insight gained from studying the Wallace Line is the importance of ecological interactions in shaping evolution. When species are isolated, they do not evolve in a vacuum. They interact with predators, competitors, and prey, and these interactions drive adaptation. A predator evolving sharper teeth or better camouflage influences the evolution of its prey. Plants developing chemical defenses influence the insects that feed on them. These relationships create complex webs of coevolution in which changes in one species influence changes in others. Over millions of years, these interactions produce ecosystems that are finely balanced and uniquely adapted to their environments. Isolation preserves these systems, allowing them to develop in distinct ways. When barriers are removed and ecosystems mix, the results can be unpredictable. Some species thrive, others decline, and entirely new interactions emerge. This understanding has important implications for conservation. Human activities are now altering barriers that once separated ecosystems. Species are transported across oceans, habitats are fragmented or connected in new ways, and climate change is shifting the ranges of many organisms. Studying boundaries like the Wallace Line helps scientists anticipate how such changes might affect biodiversity, by providing examples of how ecosystems respond to isolation and contact over long periods. There is also a philosophical lesson in all this, one that goes beyond biology. The Wallace Line reminds us that the world is shaped by processes that operate on timescales far longer than our own lives. The patterns we see today are the result of events that began millions of years ago, long before humans existed. Reflecting on this can be both humbling and calming. It places our own experiences in a broader context, reminding us that the Earth has been changing slowly and steadily for immense spans of time, and that life has adapted again and again to those changes. If you imagine standing on one of the islands near this boundary, watching the sea stretch toward the horizon, it is difficult to perceive the depth of history beneath those waters. The waves look the same as they did yesterday. The forest behind you hums with insects and birds, just as it has for countless generations. And yet, the animals in that forest are the result of millions of years of evolution shaped by ancient continents, deep oceans, and rare events of dispersal. The Wallace Line taught scientists that understanding life requires looking beyond the present moment, beyond the visible landscape, into the deep past where the foundations of modern ecosystems were laid. It also showed that patterns in nature often have explanations that are not immediately obvious. A boundary invisible to the eye can be one of the most powerful influences on the distribution of life. As research continued, scientists began to apply these lessons to other regions, using the principles revealed by the Wallace Line to interpret patterns of biodiversity around the world. Each new study added to a growing understanding of how evolution, geography, and time interact. If you could stand today on a small boat drifting in the warm seas between the islands near this invisible boundary, nothing about the view would suggest that you were floating above one of the most important biological divisions on the planet. The water would move gently against the hull. Perhaps flying fish would scatter in quick flashes of silver. Seabirds might circle overhead, their shadows sliding across the surface in slow arcs. In every visible way, the scene would feel peaceful, ordinary and timeless, and yet, the boundary beneath you is not just a feature of the past, it is still active in shaping the living world today. The animals on either side continue to follow evolutionary paths influenced by that long history of separation. Forests still shelter species found nowhere else. Birds still mark the transition from Asian lineages to those more closely related to Australia. The Wallace Line remains, not as a relic, but as a living boundary, one that continues to influence ecosystems in ways both subtle and profound. But the world around that boundary is changing, and it is changing more rapidly now than at almost any time in recent geological history. One of the most significant forces shaping these changes is human activity. For most of the time that the Wallace Line has existed, the barriers that defined it were reinforced by the limits of natural movement. Oceans were difficult to cross, forests remained largely intact, species spread slowly if at all between regions. Today those limits have been altered. Ships, airplanes and global trade move plants and animals across the world in ways that would once have been impossible. Sometimes this movement is deliberate, as when species are introduced for agriculture or pest control. Other times it happens accidentally, seeds carried in cargo, insects hidden in wood or packaging, small animals transported unknowingly. When a species arrives in a new environment where it has no natural predators or competitors, it can sometimes spread rapidly, disrupting ecosystems that evolved in isolation for millions of years. Islands are particularly vulnerable to this process. Many island species evolved without certain types of predators or diseases, and they may lack defenses against new arrivals. A single introduced predator can have dramatic effects on populations of birds, reptiles, or small mammals that have never faced such threats before. This is why conservation efforts in regions near the Wallace Line often focus on protecting native species and preventing the introduction of invasive ones. The uniqueness of these ecosystems makes them especially valuable, but also especially fragile. Another major influence on these regions is habitat loss. Forests in many parts of Southeast Asia and surrounding islands have been cleared for agriculture, logging, and development. When forests shrink or become fragmented, species that depend on large continuous habitats may decline or disappear. Fragmentation also alters the movement of animals within regions. Populations that were once connected become isolated in smaller patches of habitat, reducing genetic diversity and making them more vulnerable to environmental changes. This kind of isolation is different from the ancient isolation that shaped evolution across the Wallace Line. It happens much more quickly, over decades rather than millions of years, and species often do not have time to adapt. Climate change adds another layer of complexity. Rising temperatures, shifting rainfall patterns, and changing sea levels are already affecting ecosystems across the region. Coral reefs, which support enormous biodiversity, are sensitive to temperature changes and may suffer bleaching events when waters become too warm. Changes in climate can also alter the ranges of species. Some animals may move to higher elevations or different regions in search of suitable conditions. Others may be unable to move, either because suitable habitat is unavailable or because barriers prevent dispersal. In some cases, climate change may even alter the effectiveness of natural boundaries. As temperatures and habitats shift, species that were once confined to certain regions may expand their ranges, bringing them into contact with species from other areas. This process is gradual, and its long-term effects are still unfolding, but it illustrates an important point. Boundaries in nature are not fixed forever. They can change as the environment changes. At the same time, conservation efforts are working to protect many of the unique ecosystems near this boundary. National parks, wildlife reserves, and marine protected areas help preserve habitats and the species that depend on them. Scientists and local communities collaborate to monitor wildlife populations, restore degraded habitats, and develop sustainable practices that balance human needs with environmental protection. These efforts are often challenging because the pressures on land and resources are significant, but they are also essential because once a species disappears, it cannot be brought back. The evolutionary history preserved in these ecosystems represents millions of years of natural development, and protecting it helps maintain the diversity of life on Earth. There is also a growing recognition that local communities play a crucial role in conservation. Many people living near these ecosystems depend on forests, rivers, and coastal waters for their livelihoods. Sustainable management of these resources can benefit both people and wildlife, ensuring that ecosystems remain healthy for future generations. Education and awareness are important parts of this process. When people understand the significance of the ecosystems around them, the invisible boundaries, the unique species, the deep history written in landscapes, they are often more motivated to protect them. Another interesting aspect of the Wallace Line today is how it continues to be a focus of scientific research. Advances in genetics allow scientists to study the relationships between species in greater detail than ever before. By comparing DNA, researchers can trace the history of populations, estimate when they diverged, and identify patterns of migration and isolation. These studies often confirm the patterns first observed by naturalists more than a century ago, but they also reveal new complexities. Some species show evidence of occasional crossings, others of long-term stability, and still others of recent changes influenced by human activity. Technology has also improved our ability to monitor ecosystems. Satellite imagery helps track changes in forests and coastlines. Acoustic monitoring records the sounds of birds and insects, providing information about biodiversity. Camera traps capture images of elusive animals, revealing behaviours and movements that would otherwise go unnoticed. Despite these advances, there is still much to learn. The region around the Wallace Line remains one of the most biologically diverse areas on Earth, and new species are still being discovered, especially among insects, plants, and marine organisms. This ongoing discovery reminds us that the natural world is not fully known, that there are still mysteries waiting to be explored, patterns waiting to be recognized, connections waiting to be understood. Reflecting on the present also invites us to think about the future. The ecosystems on either side of this boundary will continue to change, influenced by climate, geology, and human activity. Some species may decline, others may adapt, and new evolutionary paths may emerge over time. Evolution has never stopped. It is a continuous process, shaping life in response to changing conditions. The Wallace Line itself may shift in significance as environments change and species move. And yet, the underlying lesson remains the same. Geography matters, history matters. The deep structure of the Earth, the depth of oceans, the movement of continents, all leave lasting imprints on the living world. There is something quietly reassuring in recognizing this continuity. Even as human activities alter landscapes and climates, the fundamental processes that shape life, adaptation, selection, diversification, continue to operate, slowly but persistently. If you imagine once more that quiet boat drifting above the invisible boundary, the sky fading toward evening, the sea reflecting soft colours of sunset, it becomes easier to sense the long continuity of the natural world. Beneath the surface, unseen contours guide currents. Beneath those currents lie sediments recording ancient climates. And within the forests on distant shores, species continue to live, feed and reproduce, just as their ancestors have done for countless generations. The Wallace Line is not just a story about the past, it is part of a living world, one that is still unfolding, still changing, still offering new questions to anyone who pauses long enough to observe. By the time most people reach the end of a long story, there is often a sense that everything has been neatly explained, that the journey has reached a clear destination. But with subjects like this, the ending feels a little different. The more closely we look at the natural world, the more we realise that every explanation opens the door to another question, and every boundary we understand leads us to notice others we had never seen before. The Wallace Line began as a quiet observation about animals and islands, but turns out to be part of something much larger. It is one example of a pattern that repeats across the Earth, a reminder that the living world is shaped not only by what is visible, but also by hidden divisions, slow changes, and histories that stretch far beyond human memory. If you think about it, invisible lines are everywhere in nature. Some are drawn by temperature, like the boundaries in the ocean where warm currents meet cold ones, and entire communities of fish and plankton change within a surprisingly short distance. Others are created by altitude, where climbing a mountain can feel like travelling from the tropics to the Arctic in the space of a single day, with forests giving way to grasslands, and grasslands to bare rock and snow. There are boundaries defined by soil, where certain plants grow on one side of a valley but not the other, because the minerals in the ground differ just enough to matter. There are boundaries formed by rainfall, where a wet forest gradually becomes a dry savanna and then a desert, even though the land itself slopes gently and the sky above looks the same. Each of these lines shapes life in ways that are not always obvious at first glance. Only by paying attention, by noticing patterns, do they begin to reveal themselves. That, in many ways, is one of the most valuable lessons from the story we have been following. The world often hides its most important patterns in plain sight. The forests, the oceans, the animals, all carry clues about the past, but those clues only become meaningful when someone takes the time to observe carefully and ask questions. Alfred Russel Wallace did exactly that. He noticed something that others had overlooked, and in doing so he helped change the way we understand the distribution of life. But the principle extends far beyond one person or one discovery. It is a reminder that curiosity, patience, and careful observation can reveal connections that are not immediately visible. It is also worth reflecting on how much of our understanding of the world depends on patterns rather than single events. A single bird on an island does not tell us much, but hundreds of observations collected over years begin to form a picture. The absence of certain species becomes as important as their presence. The repetition of a pattern across many islands begins to suggest an underlying cause. In this way, science often works quietly, building understanding piece by piece, much like the slow processes of evolution that shape the natural world itself. Another thought that comes to mind when considering invisible boundaries is how they influence not only animals and plants, but also people. Human cultures, languages, and traditions often follow patterns shaped by geography. Mountain ranges, rivers, and coastlines have guided migration and settlement for thousands of years, creating differences in ways of life that persist even today. Sometimes these cultural boundaries are as subtle as differences in dialect or cuisine. Other times they are more pronounced, but even then they often reflect underlying patterns of environment and history. In a sense, the idea of invisible lines connects the natural world and the human world in a quiet and thoughtful way. Both are shaped by geography, by movement, by separation, and by the passage of time. There is also something calming about recognizing how slowly many of these processes unfold. The Wallace Line itself has existed in one form or another for millions of years. The continents drift at the pace of a few centimeters per year. Evolution proceeds generation by generation, often so gradually that no single change is noticeable. In a world where so much seems fast and urgent, it can be reassuring to remember that the Earth moves to a different rhythm, one measured in deep time, where change is steady but unhurried. If you imagine the islands near this boundary once more, perhaps at dusk, you might picture the forest growing quiet as the light fades, insects beginning their evening calls, waves moving gently along the shore. Nothing about that scene would suggest the immense history beneath it. The shifting continents, the rising and falling seas, the countless generations of animals adapting to their environments. And yet all of that history is present, written in the shapes of beaks and teeth, in the patterns of feathers and fur, in the distribution of species across islands and oceans. It is easy to overlook such things in everyday life. Most of us move through landscapes without thinking about how they came to be, or how long the processes shaping them have been at work. But once you begin to notice, it becomes difficult not to see the traces of history everywhere. A coastline reveals the slow work of waves and tides. A valley shows the path of an ancient river. A forest reflects centuries of growth, disturbance, and renewal. And in places like the region of the Wallace Line, the distribution of animals tells a story that reaches back millions of years. Another aspect worth considering is how fragile some of these patterns can be. Boundaries that existed for ages can be altered within a few decades by human activity. Forests can be cleared. Species can be introduced to new environments. Climate can change more rapidly than many organisms can adapt. This does not mean that nature will stop evolving or that ecosystems will disappear entirely. But it does remind us that the diversity of life we see today is the result of a very long history, and that preserving it requires care and attention. Conservation in many ways is about respecting the deep time of the natural world, recognizing that what exists now is the product of processes far older than our own species. There is also a quiet sense of wonder in realizing how much remains unknown. Even today, scientists continue to discover new species in the forests and seas of Southeast Asia and beyond. Each discovery adds another piece to the puzzle, another reminder that the living world is more complex and varied than we often imagine. And perhaps that sense of wonder is one of the most important things to carry away from this journey. The world is full of patterns waiting to be noticed, stories waiting to be understood, and connections waiting to be made. As you think about invisible lines, it may be interesting to notice them in other places as well. The boundary between day and night, for example, moves continuously across the earth, a line of shadow that never stops travelling. The line between land and sea shifts with every tide. The boundary between seasons moves gradually as the earth circles the sun. Some lines are sharp, others blurred, but all of them remind us that the world is not static. It is a system in motion, shaped by forces that operate across scales of space and time that are sometimes difficult to imagine. Returning once more to the Wallace Line, it is remarkable to think that a boundary first recognised through careful observation in the 19th century remains one of the clearest examples of how geography shapes life. It continues to be studied not only because of what it reveals about the past, but also because of what it can teach us about the future. As climates change and ecosystems shift, understanding the role of barriers and connections becomes increasingly important. The lessons learned from this invisible line help scientists predict how species may respond to changing conditions, where new boundaries might form and how existing ones might shift. In this way, the Wallace Line is not only a story about history, it is also a guide to understanding the processes that continue to shape the living world. For now, though, it is enough to sit with the idea itself, the quiet presence of boundaries that shape life without announcing themselves, the slow unfolding of patterns that become visible only when we step back and look carefully. And if you find yourself thinking about this as you settle in for the night, perhaps imagine those islands again, scattered across warm seas, forests breathing in the evening air, animals moving quietly through the undergrowth, each one part of a story that began long before humans ever asked why. Somewhere beyond the horizon, another island waits, similar in appearance yet different in the lives it holds, separated not by walls or fences, but by history, by deep water, by the patient unfolding of time. It is a gentle reminder that the world is full of hidden structures, quiet patterns, and invisible lines, and that understanding them often begins with something very simple: the willingness to look closely, to notice, and to wonder. And with that thought, the journey comes to rest, not with a sharp ending, but with the quiet sense that the world beyond this moment is still unfolding, still changing, still offering new stories to anyone who pauses long enough to listen.